Dustin Coates.
I like it when you guys are together and talking about voice.
Without further ado,
Welcome to the show.
Boom. And just like that, we are live.
There we go.
Welcome. Welcome, Tom. How's it going?
All right, thank you. Thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. This has been a long time on the cards, this, Tom. This has been... How long has this been coming for?
I don't know. I was just thinking back to when we first met, which was at the London chatbot and voice assistant meetup.
Yeah.
Got back in like 2017, maybe even.
Well been.
I think it might have even been before VUX World podcast even existed.
It could well have been, yeah. I think it might have been while it was kind of being planned and stuff like that. I think it was like November. I want to say November 2017 or something like that.
Wow, God, it's a long time ago. It's feels like a different era, really.
It does a bit. It does a little bit. Like, I think that things have definitely changed, and that might be something we can get into. Is even though that's not that long ago. I mean, Dustin, when did you start writing your book? Was that 2017, 2018?
Maybe in 2016.
Really?
2016 or 2017. Yeah.
Because that seems like ages ago as well when you were going through that process. But in reality, I mean, 2017 to now, it's not that long ago, but so much has changed and moved on, hasn't it? Even in 2, 3, 4 years, it's crazy.
Well, we'll have lots to talk about what you learned over those past 3 years, Tom.
Hopefully
Yeah.
I learned something.
Yeah. I'm sure you have. And if anyone's tuning in, I can see there's people tuning in. If you have any questions for Tom, feel free to stick them in the comments, and we'll put them to Tom. So, Tom, I mean, where do we start? I don't even know where to start, really. I mean, we've kind of met a few times in London. You've had a really good meetup going over there, which I've spoke at a number of times, attended quite a few times. You've got LabWorks, which is doing fantastically. Congratulations on the funding that you rose recently. And so you've got a lot of experience in working with voice assistants, and more importantly, not just working with them like plenty of other people do, but actually building a business in that kind of environment. So I wonder whether maybe a place to start might be, just broadly speaking, what's the last sort of year been like? Everyone's been staying at home. Everyone's had access to their kind of smart speakers around them all the time. Like, what's the last sort of 12 months been like for you and LabWorks?
Yeah, if just really quick, Tom, if you don't mind as well, talking a little bit about what LabWorks builds as well.
Good point. I'm getting too over ahead of myself here. That's good. Let's start there, and then let's go after that to the last year. Yeah, good idea.
All right, let me start with a kind of potted introduction. So I'm Tom. I'm the founder of LabWorks.io. We make something called Voice Arcade. It's a collection of games on your smart speaker, on your Alexa device, and your Google Assistant. We've been going since 2017. And we are in 8 different countries. 8 different languages, 14 different countries. So we kind of have built out this, what I think is one of the kind of main voice gaming offerings on the platform. And, I think as kind of part of that, we've been really at the forefront of trying to figure out how to kind of build a business on Alexa and Google Assistant, how to kind of actually make that work. And yeah, it's been really, really interesting. So the last year, well, I mean, like everybody, the pandemic did cause a big increase in traffic. A lot of people started using it. But one of the things that's been really interesting to us is that in previous years, we really observed a seasonality effect where, people were really playing voice games heavily in the winter, particularly around Christmas, and at a few kind of other key points in the year. Whereas last year, it was much more steady throughout the year. Like, we kind of saw the traffic, in the kind of the months that we would usually expect to be lower, kind of up at a higher rate, which kind of reduced that seasonal effect. So I think that's something that's really interesting, and something that I'm still not exactly certain whether that's going to continue after lockdowns end, or whether that is a new behavior shift that people are just used to playing voice games more regularly now.
It's interesting, that, isn't it? Like, is there kind of, so obviously Christmas time people get new devices, they experiment a lot more when they first kind of get hold of them and things like that. Is there kind of like, you mentioned that in general, is it been like steady kind of thing throughout the year? Like, has there been weekend spikes? I would imagine that would traditionally maybe be the case. Like, what is it just been like completely steady in terms of usage? Would you say?
Yeah, I'm not going to say that like the kind of the traffic that you get in June is exactly the same as you get at Christmas. Obviously, Christmas is still a bigger thing, but in previous years, the kind of the difference between Christmas and the middle of summer was like very pronounced. Whereas last year, what we saw was kind of Christmas pre-pandemic, that was kind of as expected, but what we saw was the kind of what we expected to be quieter months, actually the traffic levels coming up as people were in lockdown. So I think people have been using their voice assistants more and more to play games. I suspect that's largely because everyone's bored at home. I mean, I sit at home and I'm like, what am I going to do today? I personally have played more games in the last year than since I was a teenager. I think, because there's nothing else to do, and gaming is great. Like, it's a great kind of escapist thing. And I think that our games, which are kind of very, very kind of casual, something that people can play together, really help to just kind of like break up the monotony of a lockdown evening for kind of 20 minutes, half an hour, that kind of spark a discussion. We're really interested in this. Our whole kind of like philosophy at kind of LabWorks about Voice Arcade is we build games that bring people together. We want to build games that kind of get people together in the same room, talking to each other, having fun, having conversation. It's kind of, we look at our games as kind of almost like facilitating conversations between the people that are playing them. I think that the pandemic has increased the need for that, because people are just stuck at home together more, and so have less to talk to each other about.
And Tom, what I'm curious about is, you're talking about that growth. Are you seeing mainly the growth coming from new users coming on, or is it more retention overall?
I think it's a mix of both. Sorry, that's a really unhelpful answer. We definitely have seen kind of new users coming on. However, you also expect kind of retention to increase as people play your games, and as your games have been longer in the market. On day one, every user is going to be new, and after you've had a game out for 3 years, you'd expect a lot more of them to be returning users. It's very hard to kind of discern whether that is purely COVID or whether there's other things. My suspicion is that that we're getting new users in, like extra new users coming in because of COVID, and that just the nature of the kind of the games being around for longer, work that we've been doing to increase retention and stuff is driving increased retention. But hard to pick out some of these things, unfortunately.
Interesting. What's the? I mean, Richard had mentioned. I'm guessing that the interpretation of this shouldn't be that last year was like one big Christmas. I think that was when you were saying about the traffic. I don't think that's what we're saying, but I think that the pandemic, as terrible as it's been for many families, certain sectors have seen decent kind of growth, decent activity. And so in this instance, you've got a company, you build voice games, you are targeting Alexa and Google Assistant. These things are in people's houses. People are spending more time at home. Usage of these devices is going up. Seems as though usage of games is going up. Was it, in hindsight, a pretty good time to launch Voice Arcade?
Well, we didn't plan on global pandemic.
Of course, but
and frankly, Voice Arcade launched as a kind of brand in September, so midway through the pandemic. I mean, we were working on it before the pandemic started, but we kind of the idea of turning all our games into kind of this single portfolio that you could just ask to open Voice Arcade and then play any of our games. That only that was not really because of the pandemic. That was something that we were doing instead. And I think that's also something that's like a little tricky to talk about with like startups, is that, like in a startup, you're obviously doing a lot of work to kind of like to grow the business and to, get more users and all those kind of other things. And so you've got these kind of like massive macro trends, and then you're also doing stuff. And it is actually like very noisy to understand, is it the things that you're doing, or is it the kind of the wider macro trend? And really, we need the world to go back to normal so that we can know. And I want the world to go back to normal because I want to go to the pub. So,
so do I. It's been too long since we've had a beer. In
yeah,
London.
Exactly.
Since I've even been to London, feels like forever.
Yeah, right. Have a off the record chat.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Speaking of off the record, it was on the record, but if anyone's listening that hasn't checked out the episode that you did with Brett Kinsella on the VoiceBook podcast, I was a bit gutted that he beat me to that episode, because I was there for your talk in Munich, and it was genuinely fantastic. We won't cover the same ground. We might get into some of it perhaps, but definitely check it out. With 10 hot takes on what it's actually like to build for voice.
I think it's funny actually that talk, because I feel like last year, about halfway through last year, everybody started saying, "Oh, there's a voice winter. There's all these like problems in the industry, particularly people building for Alexa and Google." And that talk that I gave kind of back in October the year before was really, the kind of my like articulation of those issues. And it's funny because now, like, fast forward another kind of like 18 months, and a lot of people are still talking about the voice winter. And I actually think, we're in a much more positive phase than we were, even for people that are building for Alexa and Google. So, I like to think that, we're down in the trenches trying to kind of figure stuff out. And hopefully that's kind of getting us like, early signals on which way the industry is going.
Interesting. We've got some questions coming through. I'm going to get to those questions in a minute. Those of you that have been putting them down, thanks, and keep them coming. We'll try and get through as much as we can. I do want to ask you a question about the early days, but first, you kind of alluded to something there in terms of things have changed from when you kind of gave that talk in Munich. Was that 2019? That was 2019, wasn't it?
Mm.
Yeah. Wow. God. So, what in particular do you think has changed for the better since then?
So in October 2019, or certainly during 2019, I developed a feeling that Amazon and Google had, to an extent, taken their foot off the pedal. I wasn't quite sure exactly where they were going with these platforms, and kind of how much third-party developers really meant to them. And that led to that talk, which was kind of basically a list of the things that needed fixing on those platforms to work, like fixing discovery, fixing monetization, fixing retention, basically trying to kind of spell out why it was that people were struggling to kind of build businesses on those platforms. I think that the platforms have done a fair amount over the last 18 months to address that. I'm not saying that we're there. Like, I'm not saying that kind of the problem is solved, but, when you look around, there are green shoots. There are people out there that are making meaningful amounts of money out of in-skill purchasing. There are people that, the Discovery Challenge although not solved, it some of the things that Amazon has been doing with screen-based devices does seem to have some interesting effects. I kind of feel more hopeful for the platforms than I did 18 months ago, if I'm honest.
That's good. That's interesting. So we'll get to some of these questions in a moment, and I think there's a couple asking about discoverability. So it would be nice to get into that in terms of like how you're approaching it and things like that. But first, I don't know if David Law is tuning in, but if he is, shout out to David Law. We had him on a Clubhouse session the other week, and he reminded me of a time that I think you've spoken about before, but I don't know if you've spoken about it for a while. So for those that don't know, I think the history of LabWorks is that you were building chatbots at the time, was it? And then you one day just decided to experiment on a weekend with a bit of downtime on building a skill for Alexa. Turned out that skill actually ended up doing fairly well, although you weren't really paying that much attention to it, so you didn't particularly know. and then you got a phone call, and I believe that phone call was from David Law, wasn't it?
It was indeed. I mean, shout out to David Lowe. He's actually on our board of advisors. He's a very integral part of the business. He was my introduction to the Alexa world. I as you say, I was building chatbots at the time, and I was doing client side stuff. I was kind of building chatbots for brands like Unilever and Danone and Sage and stuff. Alexa came to the UK, and I thought, well, it's likely that these people are going to ask me to design stuff for Alexa eventually. Better like figure out what you can do on Alexa. And so I decided to build a little game just because I love games, and I thought it would be a neat thing to kind of work on as a hobby project. And then it did just happen to kind of hit the moment and was really successful. And as David said, he kind of rang me up out of the blue to say, hey, do you know this is the third most popular thing on the platform? And I had no idea because I hadn't put any analytics on it. And they told me that they were just starting this program called Developer Awards, and that they were going to start paying me money for this like little hobby project that I'd built. I almost thought it was like a prank call when I first got it. But I kind of once I calmed down, I did the math, and I realized that if I could kind of take that money and use it to hire someone and build another game, then I could like turn this into a real business. And so that's what I did. I kind of took the money that they gave me and I used it to hire someone, and we built another game, and that gave us enough money that we were able to hire a couple more people and then build another game and more people, and so on and so on. And so that's kind of, the company grew very organically, but all out of Developer Awards. Our kind of mission over the last 2 years really has been to reduce our reliance on Developer Awards. That kind of program has been wound down significantly over the last 2 years. We kind of needed to find a way to kind of bring in revenue to pay for a team of 8 without kind of relying on Amazon just to give you cash the whole time. In-skill purchasing is the way that kind of Amazon set out that we should kind of go about this, that developers should go about this. And so it's been a kind of an interesting journey for us over the last 2 years to kind of figure out, well, how do you make in-skill purchasing really work? What is it that people will be willing to pay for? And I think that's really interesting.
I think that's going to be a topic of interest for a lot of people. We see a few questions here. So maybe if you don't mind jumping into that a little bit, what have you learned about what works, what doesn't work for ISPs?
So, I mean, it's the problem is this probably isn't going to be that helpful advice to anyone, unfortunately. We did a lot of user research around ISPs and a lot of testing. We already had kind of a bunch of successful games. And so we had the luxury of being able to test lots of different models and explore what did and didn't work. And when we kind of combined that with user research, and we kind of came to the conclusion that the reason that people weren't buying stuff or weren't kind of purchasing ISPs in a large enough amount to kind of make a sustainable business was because we weren't providing enough value. Like it was really as simple as that, was that people just didn't find voice skills and voice games valuable enough to be willing to pay for them. And once we kind of hit upon that insight, we kind of like flipped our thinking to, well, how do we make something that's valuable enough that people will pay for it? And we spent some time thinking about it and working on it, and that's kind of what brought us to Voice Arcade. That's what made us build and launch Voice Arcade.
Interesting.
What is it then about Voice Arcade what's the value that people are seeing in Voice Arcade that they weren't seeing before?
So the big difference is that whereas in each of our games previously you were buying content or lives or whatever in like the individual game, Voice Arcade, you're signing up for like a subscription to the entire portfolio. So we're no longer selling people on an individual like game. We're selling them on the kind of the premise of a whole collection of games. And so the value proposition that you get from that is much, much higher. For the user, they pay once and get access to like 8 different games. So, it kind of feels to them like they get much more value.
Do you think I think you've touched on something really interesting there. Do you think that's part of the trouble? I promise people we will get to your questions. I know there's been quite a few more come through. But this is quite an interesting angle in that you realize that having all of this suite of games together makes more sense. And I don't know how much is the subscription for Voice Arcade?
It's 99p a month or 99 cents a month.
So in that instance, you're giving away far more than you're kind of asking for in return. 99 pence for access to all them games and everything else that comes with it is like you could probably make the argument to say that you're giving away far more value than you're actually asking for in payment. Do you think that's been half of the issue with people with ISPs, is that they just can't demonstrate enough or more value than it seems it's worth paying for? Does that make sense? Yeah,
well, I think that's really interesting. It kind of takes me back to it's a really great quote that I read from Bezos, actually. He said, there are 2 types of companies. The types of companies that work ever harder to charge their customers more, and there are types of companies that work ever harder to charge their customers less, and Amazon wants to be the second kind. And I also think that LabWorks wants to be the second kind. We want to give the user the most value that we possibly can for the lowest amount of cost. And, we have spent a lot of time and effort thinking like, how do we retool the business to, drive down costs? How do we make things as efficient as possible? When I kind of talk about, why this isn't necessarily that helpful advice to kind of someone starting out, like, we had the luxury because we got like a load of different games that we could bring them into a single shared code base, so that any updates that we need to do happen again across the whole portfolio. And there are kind of like good like economies of scale once you can start doing stuff like that allows you to do a lot more with less. We've found that for us that model works, that we're able to drive down the cost sufficiently to be able to provide the service at a price that we think is kind of pretty much, for most customers, they're like, oh, well, yeah, I'm quite happy to pay 99p a month. It's, it's not much, and if I've got a game and I like it, yeah, why not?
And I think that's really interesting because you're showing that you're showing this value. But I think there are a few questions, and I've got this question as well about how are you getting users into the skill and then showing them that value? Because LabWorks is a known brand amongst us, but for your average Alexa user, it may not be. So how are you showing them that indeed it is worth this 99 cents, this 99 pence a month?
So from a kind of a pure like mechanics point of view, when you play one of our games, at the end of it, it says, would you like to play something else? And you say yes, and it takes you to another game within Voice Arcade. We're very careful to brand everything as Voice Arcade. From a kind of a consumer point of view, actually, yeah, they don't know who LabWorks are at all, but they do know about Voice Arcade. When we do kind of tests, we do see that people that play voice games do know what Voice Arcade is. They do have awareness of that. And I think that is really interesting for us. So yeah, we kind of think that we were able to use our existing kind of usage on the platform. We already had a lot of users in order to kind of promote the new service to them all, if that makes sense.
There's questions that very much of them, some of them are very similar to this, so we probably won't get to them all, but this is a good one that encapsulates the whole thing. So we've talked about discoverability a few times. It was one of the things that you mentioned in 2019 being one of the real kind of difficult challenges. So how is it that you're kind of solving, how are you kind of acquiring users, I suppose, is the question. How are you approaching this discoverability thing? You've obviously had great success in the early days, and that's given awareness probably, and maybe some default behaviors that users kind of go to. Even me myself, would you rather is the first thing that kind of pops in my head when I think about playing a game, and so it's just naturally the thing that if I do want to do something like that, then that's kind of the thing that comes into my head. So what is it that you kind of did do to acquire users, and has that changed now that you've got a more established user base?
Yeah.
Sorry, Dustin.
Oh no, I was just going to say, I think Pete Haas is asking a similar question as well. Are you doing ads, landing pages? How much is Amazon featuring you? Ken, you mentioned would you rather. I was cooking lunch earlier, and it suggested, would you like to play Would You Rather? I was like, hey, I know that guy. But how much is that helping versus those outbound, those external efforts you're doing?
Yeah, so I mean, there's kind of like two things. Like, one is I've kind of already discussed. We leverage off our existing traffic to introduce new games to people that are kind of playing our other games, and that's pretty effective. We do continue to get support from both platforms. I don't want to just talk about Alexa. I know that's kind of like the topic of the business, but we are also on Google in whatever the 14 different countries as well. We do a lot, and it's a meaningful share of the business. It's not like we're just on Alexa with like a little bit of Google. Google is also a really big part of what we do. We do get support from the platforms. That is largely because we have this belief in kind of innovation and quality. Like, we really believe that everything we should do should be like pushing the boundary of what the platforms can do. We want to make the best voice experiences possible, and we do the kind of like the boring work that makes a product good, like fixing all the bugs, like testing things like 200 times, even after you're like, I can't bear to listen to this thing again. Building good product is not rocket science. It's often really quite boring. And people don't like doing it, but that's what it takes to make your product good. And if you make your product good, the platforms are always looking for stuff to share with their users. And you can see that in your numbers. If you make like a skill or a game that's got good retention, like, it gets promoted more. Like, there's not anything that like no one else can do. Like, if you build something that's good, it will get promoted, because the platforms they're literally desperate to promote stuff, because frankly it's like it's like us and Volley and Matchbox that are kind of like making stuff, and like nobody else seems to make anything anymore. So like it kind of, they're desperate for new people to make kind of high quality things that they can promote. But the reality is that I think that the bar has risen to the point now where, as an individual developer, you would really struggle to produce something high quality enough to get that promotion. We have like a team of people that are specialists. We've got specialists, we've got a graphic designer, we've got developers, we've got kind of people that do all sorts of different things and are really expert at the thing that they do. And you kind of need that in order to build something that's really high quality. And I think that a single person on their own, it's actually really difficult for them to do that, unfortunately.
Kane, I think we should, that was really good. I think we should cut that out and release that as a standalone video. I think that was really good, Tom.
That should be a snippet.
But it's interesting what you mentioned the very end there, because we also have a question from Marek, who's asking, what would be your word of advice for voice dev hobbyists wanting to go professional? So it seems you take a dim view of someone being able to build these skills to the quality that's necessary to be professional just doing that. But if somebody wanted to jump into it or maybe get started, what would be your advice there?
Oh, I definitely don't take a dim view of it. It's to be highly encouraged. I was a hobbyist. Like, I started out as someone playing around with a platform. It can happen to anyone. Think about like Flappy Bird on mobile. There were already plenty of good games on mobile by the time Flappy Bird came out. Angry Birds, whatever. There were loads of big hitters already out there. Flappy Bird, built by some Vietnamese guy, that it was like his first app he ever built. Worldwide sensation. The guy made millions and millions off of it. There is no reason that it has to be kind of one of the pre-existing people. I just think that it's a lot harder if you're not one of the kind of, if you don't have that team around you. You're relying much more on kind of being able to strike it lucky to kind of come up with the exact perfect concept at the exact moment in time. One of the things that we're looking at as a business, trying to kind of pay people's salaries every month, is how do we make it reliable and sustainable? How do we make sure that every month we're bringing in enough revenue that we can pay everyone's salaries? And that leads to a different type of kind of process, and actually leaves the door wide open to hobbyists that aren't constrained with that, because you can afford to be much more experimental. When you're kind of a studio, and particularly as soon as you kind of venture capital funded, you've got very strict rules about what you're trying to do, and what angle you're going at, and you've sold all these people on a business plan that you've now got to fulfill. And it's entirely possible that your kind of concept is wrong, and somebody else that's not constrained by any of that is going to discover some kind of new thing that's going to be twice as big, and there's not a lot that you can do about it. So actually, I would encourage everyone that's kind of hobbyists to kind of keep going, because I think that that's where the real innovation is going to come from.
Interesting. That's a good point, Nat. I think that the experimentation is an interesting one, because you could be potentially what's the word? You could be you could think that the experimentation is kind of being done as such. Now, I was thinking about this the other day. On Alexa, we know that it's very good for accessing audio, videos, podcasts, music. Fantastic. We know that it's very good for kind of laid back, sort of interactive but not too interactive kind of stories and stuff like that, where you can, I do it with my kid. We'll have an interactive kind of story on a BBC something, and it's you don't really have to pay too much attention to it, but it's there. And we know it's very good for the more lean into kind of gaming environments like you've kind of described. With the jury's still out on whether it's a service channel. We probably won't get to that, but how much experimentation into new formats and stuff like that do you do? And do you think that the kind of you kind of alluded to it there, but I'm wondering how much you've learned through your experience through doing this for a long time in terms of figuring out how it should be done, and how much kind of experimentation you think there is still to be had in the platforms.
I mean, I think that the experimentation that we do is kind of like very constrained around like kind of a few key things that we think are really important. So we believe in voice first screen devices. We kind of believe that 5 years out from now, that most people will be interacting with our games on a TV with a voice assistant. So it kind of makes sense for us to really kind of understand and get good at how do you make that kind of multimodal experience work? Like how do you kind of join visuals and voice together in a way where you're kind of controlling the kind of the interaction via voice? So, we do a lot of thinking around that. We care a lot about recognition. This industry wouldn't exist without the kind of the improvements in recognition that we saw, with the introduction of far field mics. Like, before that, IVR existed, but what kind of created the most recent wave of voice startups and voice businesses is the kind of the improvements in recognition that we've seen. And we believe that that's a kind of like a foundation for everything, and that anything that we can do to improve the recognition in our games just like has a huge impact on retention, on session length, on people's willingness to pay. Like, it's just massive, because what I take away from that is that people want to play these experiences and want to pay for them, and where they are not, it's because the technology is letting them down. It's the recognition technology is letting them down. And if we can do things to fix that, then they're going to play more. And I think that's really, really great. And also has the benefit of being like scalable across all our games. So, I spend a lot of time worrying about like, how do we do things that are scalable across the entire portfolio? And then kind of, I think the rest of the innovation stuff, we're still really trying to understand, like, how do you tell people about kind of something that you play on a smart speaker? How do you kind of like market that? And I think somebody asked in the questions about running ads and buying in traffic, etc. And obviously we do a lot of experimentation around that. We've run kind of Google ad campaigns, Facebook ad campaigns, the works, to try and understand how much does it cost to acquire a user, like doing that. What does that actually look like? How valuable is that user to you? And I think that is I think that stuff is kind of really, really interesting and really like integral to kind of the next phase of the industry as kind of things continue to professionalize. I mean, if you look at like mobile gaming, paid acquisition over time has become a really big thing, to the point now where, most indie developers are completely drowned out because they just can't get, they just don't have the budgets to do the kind of paid acquisition needed to make it work anymore.
Staying on the experimentation topic, you also mentioned quite a bit earlier that you also work and try out these new technologies, these new platform features. And I'm curious how you go about deciding which ones to prioritize, which ones to focus on. Because as someone who was very bullish on Alexa gadgets and Alexa buttons and things like that, how do you make sure you don't make the same mistake I did?
Don't talk to me about Alexa buttons. We built Alexa buttons into all our games as well. So I'm familiar with your pain, and I'm sure if you were one of the early developers like we were, you'll feel our pain for just how difficult that was. But that's the kind of the flip side of being on the bleeding edge, is that sometimes you get cut. And that's just kind of part and parcel of it. But I kind of think that innovation, kind of experimentation piece is really important if you're trying to kind of drive forward a business and drive forward an industry. It's kind of why I get up in the morning is to kind of actually like try and do something. I don't kind of sit there and like play through like other games on Alexa and be like, oh, okay, like this is something that we can like copy or whatever. It's we kind of want to create stuff that is like new and fun and actually brings a kind of exciting new experience to the platform. I think frankly, like, people don't go into making games to be rich. Like, if you want to like run a startup and be rich, then like make a SaaS platform, some B2B SaaS platform. People make games because they love making games. Like as a team, we're kind of highly motivated by, is this even going to be any fun? Like, can we experiment with this thing? Like, we play test it internally. Is it fun? Does it add some kind of like new type of gameplay or something that we think is going to be, people are going to be excited to play? And if the answer is yes, then we implement it. And if the answer is no, then we just say, well, it's not right for us right now.
And are there any new platform features that you're particularly excited to integrate into your games or build a new game around?
So on Google, we're doing work with continuous match, which I think is really interesting because it allows you to it cuts a lot of the latency because the user can speak and it's kind of picked up on the device. And I think that there's some kind of and they can talk over music. It breaks you out of the kind of like the standard request response model, which I think is kind of really interesting. I think on Alexa, we're kind of more in the phase of, I think that there is everything there that you need from a kind of a platform perspective to make it work now, I believe. I mean, we talked about this before the kind of the start of the kind of the talk when we were off air. That I don't actually think that it's harder now than it was when we started, because now you've got a platform that's much more mature. You've got kind of monetization that does work. You've got a kind of reliable certification systems. Like, you've got, like, when you implement stuff, it actually works in the way you're expecting. Documentation's good. Like, it's a lot easier to build for these platforms than it was 3 years ago. And I think that does actually significantly lower the barrier to succeeding.
Interesting. You mentioned there's a couple of things. One of them was that earlier on you were talking about the speech recognition being such a crucial part, and you're right. That's for many times people used to say that it's impossible to get people through 3 turns of a conversation on Alexa because of these kind of speech recognition engines. And obviously you don't really have any control over that when you're building in Alexa. That's kind of like just part of it. And same with Google Assistant, you don't have control over the ASR. And Matt Buck is asking a question. This was a question he asked a while back, but it seems more prevalent now than it was at the beginning, which is around, have you thought or considered about doing something similar to like Novel Effect, for example, where a standalone app, voice first, there's a screen there as well. So Matt's asking if you've ever considered or tried like building something for the web, but beyond that, you've got apps and stuff like that, where you would have a lot more control over some of that kind of pipeline, like the speech recognition and things like that. Is that something you see potential in future, or do you think that the future is very much building on Alexa, Google Assistant, and working into TVs and things like that?
It's a great question. I just would like before I answer it, it's not true that there's like nothing that you can do with the Alexa and Google speech recognition. Actually, the way that you set up your intents and optimize stuff is actually really, really important for how good your recognition is. There is a big difference between just kind of like sticking something up and carefully tailoring your interaction model. So you can get good kind of improvements out of doing that kind of thing.
But But that's more on the NLU though, isn't it? Not
Yeah, right.
necessarily
Rather than the ASR. But
yeah.
you know, one of the, I don't want to get kind of bogged down because I'm not answering a question, but one of the advantages of when you're like, particularly in gaming, is that you got like, you know, the state the user is in, you know what kind of step they're going to do. And it's not like a customer service conversation where, you know, they can literally say anything and you want to kind of be able to handle it reasonably. Like, you know, in a game, if they say something that doesn't make any sense, like, but they're in a particular state of the game, you can say, well, chances are that they didn't say that. They actually are probably saying something that does something else. And, you know, obviously we do our own kind of like custom NLU on top of what we get out of Alexa and stuff to fine tune it. But, you know, you can get a long way with some of these things. And, you know, I often hear people kind of complaining about Alexa or Google, and then when you start digging into it, they're not even kind of implementing all of the features. Like they're not using kind of multi-slot values or dynamic entities or whatever. And it's like, you know, you got to like have used all the things that are available to you before you can start saying that you're not being given enough. Sorry. So anyway, so regarding the web, it's an interesting question. It's not something that we've experimented with. It's our kind of theory, our hypothesis has always been around kind of like family game night, and the kind of the idea that people are playing our games in a household together. And we feel that kind of far field microphone technology is kind of a necessary component of that. You know, certainly if we were to go into the kind of the app or web space, we would want to look like really carefully at the types of games that we would bring to those platforms, because different games are suited to different mediums. And, you know, I think that a game that would work well using your voice on a web browser is probably fairly different from one that would work well on Alexa or Google Assistant.
That's interesting. What about, you kind of alluded to this earlier, and this kind of touches on a question that Richard has also had a little bit earlier on. It's kind of twofold. One is, what do you do around your brand identity? You mentioned that people are starting to recognize the name brand Voice Arcade. You know, you do a good job of using sound effects and earcons and things like that in the experiences and stuff like that. Do you have a purposeful approach to your brand identity?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, like Voice Arcade is, you know, the kind of like the brand is a really core part of what we're doing. I mean, we looked to, when we kind of decided on this portfolio games approach and stuff, we thought about it. We said, well, like, there's going to be a problem if we kind of bring new games to the platform and people don't know how to find them. How are we going to make sure that people can always find our games? And so we decided that we needed a good kind of strong brand that we could teach people, and they could then invoke that and reliably reach our games. And that's kind of where we came up with Voice Arcade. And we see that working. You know, we see that in the data that, you know, like tens of thousands of people like a day like ask for Voice Arcade specifically. Like, you know, we know that people are learning how to kind of ask for that. And, you know, and I think that that's been really important. You know, you kind of mentioned earcons. So we have the kind of like the Voice Arcade, like, you know, that kind of plays at the start of every single game. So that kind of people know that the game is part of Voice Arcade. And, you know, just to kind of continually reinforce that idea that if you want to play games on your smart speaker, you say Alexa or Google, open Voice Arcade. And, you know, that's kind of like the message that we're always trying to kind of drive home to the people playing our games.
Nice. And Katie's, the second half of Katie's question is very similar to one that Richard asked earlier on, which is, how do you go about We've talked about discoverability in terms of getting people into the games. You've mentioned there around the education that you kind of do on a regular basis to educate people in how to get into the games by using the voice arcade invocation phrase. What about when people are in the games? What do you do around helping people discover, the game itself, the features that exist around the skill and all that kind of stuff? Like, how do you approach in skill discoverability of features and capabilities and games and things like that?
It's a really, really interesting question. I think that I'm going to give like a bit of a cop-out answer that, that if you're having to do too much kind of discovery within the skill, then it's probably not simple enough. You don't need discovery to have a conversation with a person. It's not like if we're having a conversation, I'm like, you can say these 3 things to me. Like, it should feel kind of very natural. And the kind of the frame of reference of the game. So when you're kind of like bringing people into the game world, the kind of the frame of reference that you're giving them should kind of tell them everything they need to know about like what they want to ask or don't want to ask. And then kind of beyond that, we rely very heavily on kind of like correcting, like when people make mistakes. So if they say something that doesn't work, we'll kind of say, oh, like, sorry, didn't like get that. Like, these are things that you could do or whatever, it depends. I think that something, this goes back to what I was saying about like doing the kind of like the hard, boring work that makes products great. Like every single interaction in every game has like a unique help prompt, a unique like reprompt. Like, there are if you come at it from like this place, you get one kind of message. If you come from you get like from a different part of the game, you get a different message, so that everything is always highly contextual to whatever kind of state the user is in.
Interesting. That's quite an interesting way of approaching it. And so how much of the work that you do then this is another thing I've been thinking about recently, is that people talk about the happy path and the ideal way of going through an experience and things like that. And from a game, you would expect that, or you would think that the happy path should be followed most of the time, especially if it's like a quiz or something like that. But the reality is that there's a whole lot of work to be done. You mentioned the speech recognition perhaps playing up or whatever, language model issues or what have you. So how much of the kind of, to give people a bit of an understanding about like where energy is spent, how much of the time and effort around designing a fantastic experience is spent in those areas that are outside of the typical gameplay, like the error recovery, the customized help prompts, the contextual help and all that kind of stuff? Like how much time and effort is spent around the actual main game, if that makes sense?
So this is like a good example of where doing a lot of stuff like makes you more efficient. So we're able to kind of lean heavily on like design patterns that we kind of have come up with in the past for other games within each one, that allows us to kind of we don't have to think too hard about the kind of like the mechanics of a lot of these things. It's just like, okay, right, we need to write some prompts or whatever, which is quite quick to do. I would say that without doubt, when it comes to games, like the hardest bit is building scoring mechanics, because scoring mechanics are kind of what incentivize people to play, and that is the bit that takes if you get that wrong, like no one will play your game, or they'll like play it once and never again. And it's really, really hard. I've worked in product design for a long time, and it's the most challenging thing that I've ever done in product design. I kind of think that getting that kind of game mechanic, scoring mechanic right is where you need to kind of devote most of your energy. Beyond
why is that? Before you move on, why is that so difficult?
Because it's gotta feel fun. It's gotta be really simple to understand. It's gotta feel fun. Like usually scoring mechanics sits right inside the game loop, which is the kind of like the activity that the user is doing again and again. So it's going to be highly repeated. So it's got to like not feel like frustrating or boring or repetitive. It's one of those ones where it's really hard to say like, yeah, I can't really just tell you like how to build a good kind of game mechanic or a good game loop. It's very much a kind of, you have to build something, play it. Does it feel fun? No. Okay. Like iterate it a bit. Does it feel fun? Like just again and again. But that process of getting that right can take, weeks and weeks to kind of get right. I would say that the bit that we definitely do that also takes a lot of time, that's kind of outside of like the design arena specifically, is the kind of like the testing and fixing and testing and fixing. And I mean, that can easily be like half the entire time spent on the project is just going over like what it is that you've built, like play testing it, finding out where it breaks, like user testing it, like finding out where it breaks, like just that bit again and again, that kind of like iteration until you've kind of fixed all of the edge cases takes a really long time.
How much of that is manual testing, spinning it up on device, playing it, going through it from a user perspective, versus kind of like more kind of technical testing or something like that? Is it?
I'm talking about the manual testing, like the kind of like, obviously we do like the automated testings first to like make sure that just everything technically works the way it does. But it's that kind of manual testing. You can't play test something on a console or by writing a script. Like, you can only find out if something's fun by playing it. And, frankly, as the person that designed the game, you're often not even the right person to play test it. So you end up having to get like other people to play test it, to go out and do user research in order to really understand, like, is it fun or not, and what it needs to be. And the thing that can be quite challenging about that is that, if there is something wrong, it's not always like necessarily that apparent what it is that isn't working. And so it can take like quite a few different iterations to understand, like, because it's like trial and error of like finding out, does this work? No. Is this fun? No. Is this fun? Yes. Like,
Can you give us an example of one of your games or a feature or a play mechanic within your game that ran through a lot of iteration before you got it right?
Yeah. I mean, like, it's true for all the games. But the Trivia Hero scoring mechanic, is incredibly complicated. And I think the thing that, and the thing is that it doesn't seem complicated when you play through the game as a user. But, within that, I mean, it must handle probably like at least several hundred different permutations, different kind of cases of, did you win the round? Did you lose the round? Did you come second? Like, did you beat the score that you did last time? Like, there's so many different kind of components that go into it to kind of make it feel like fun and exciting. And you can only really get that by kind of just testing stuff again and again, unfortunately.
Interesting. Richard asked another question, which I think is a good one that everyone, I think, will benefit from, which is that if you're not designing specifically for Alexa or Google Assistant, and if you're not designing games specifically as well, is there anything that you've learned through the work that you've been doing, through the testing? You obviously lean heavily on user research and testing by the sounds of things, so you're gathering a lot of real insight into how things are working and all that kind of stuff. And so, is there any principles that you tend to use, any things that you learn that you now do repeatedly as part of your process that you think would apply more generally and more broadly to anyone looking to design kind of conversational interfaces?
Yeah, so I think that that kind of point that I just made about like the iteration is kind of really key. That's something that I feel like when I worked in kind of consultancy and stuff, it was much more common that you did your like research, and then as a designer you kind of like went away and thought deep thoughts and kind of came up with the kind of the perfect design, and then it got built and shipped to the client, who inevitably then like butchered it for their business needs. But that aside, whereas in game design, you really can't do that. It's really difficult to decide, like to design something that is fun just in your own head, to kind of come up with it. You really can only tell if something is fun by building it and testing it. And I kind of see like a bit of the same thing going on in the voice industry, where like, people get really worried about like, oh, do I understand like Grice's maxims? Like, like feeling like they need to be a linguist in order to be a conversation designer. And like, I don't think that's true, because right now there is just so much low-hanging fruit, because there are so many badly designed conversations out there that can be fixed or radically improved just by doing a lot of iterative testing. And people don't like doing it because it's boring, frustrating, and if you need to kind of go out and do it in like a proper research setting, expensive. I mean, top tip, we just literally get users on Zoom and get them to play our games and just watch them on a Zoom. And it takes no time, is like, doesn't really cost much. I think we pay them like 15 quid, a session for 15 minutes. And you can bang through like a whole bunch of those like in a couple of hours. And it's really easy to organize and really easy to do. And it honestly, it's the single kind of best thing that you can do to improve the quality of your conversation that you're designing.
We do the same with kind of explorative research and role play. So just Zoom calls and just actually have a conversation.
Investigative rehearsal.
Yeah. That's a nice technical term to use. Yeah.
Nicked it off of Google. That's what they call that.
Is it? Yeah. So it used to be like back-to-back chair table reads and stuff like that, whereas just now it's Zoom call, have a conversation, see how it goes, see if it's all right. That's your first draft, and then away you go.
We actually don't do that. We always go straight to the prototype phase, because that's not necessarily advice for kind of everyone else, but like in gaming, because a game is not like a proper conversation. It's something that's a bit more unique than that. It's kind of got very like structured rules. If you just kind of role play it as a conversation with a person, the temptation to kind of like bend the rules or to answer in a way that wouldn't be appropriate for the game is too high. It's better to just get straight to the prototype. And also, we know, at least with our stuff, that like the thing that makes a huge difference is like recognition, and that we want to test straight away before we go anywhere. Can we get the recognition right on this game? And so we build a prototype straight away, because different game mechanics like have different recognition problems, and we want that prototype built straight away so we can test, is this even feasible? It doesn't need to be perfect, but if it doesn't work at all at the prototype stage, then it's probably never going to work, or it's going to take such a long time that you'll never be able to ship it.
Do you use like at that level, if you want to try and test recognition, do you kind of do you build it like in the Alexa skills kit or in Dialogflow for Google or something like that, so you can actually use the in situ technology, or do you use another prototyping tool to do that?
No. We use Jovo. So shout out to Jan and the Jovo team. We're kind of big fans of that.
Likewise, big fans of Jovo
framework. And we kind of, but we build straight onto, like, so we do the testing on an actual physical Alexa device or Google Assistant device, because we believe that we need to be able to test, is it going to work in a real world scenario before we can kind of actually get on and build the game properly.
Interesting. Wicked. Well, I love that. Dustin, any final thoughts? I know we're a little bit over time. Any final thoughts, last questions for Tom?
No, I think this was really interesting, even for, as we alluded to near the end, people who don't build games to take away a lot from this and be able to apply it to their own voice experiences.
Cool, Tom. Appreciate it so much. How can people? We've said it a few times already, but how can people try Voice Arcade?
Well, very easily. You just say, Alexa, open Voice Arcade.
Cool.
And I've set off a load of people's right there and then, so we'll be getting some free users. Woo!
Nice one. And how can people kind of follow you and keep on top of the things that you're doing and stuff like that online and stuff?
You can follow me personally just at Tom Hewitson on Twitter. LabWorks and Voice Arcade are both on Twitter and other social media platforms as you like. You can go and see us at voicearcade.com. And yeah, that's it.
Cool. Well, really appreciate it, Tom. And unfortunately, we won't be on Clubhouse after this, boys and girls, because Tom is still in the Android ecosystem and excluded from Clubhouse by the sounds of things.
To be fair, I'm not sure that I don't feel like I'm missing out on much, actually. It's like going to a conference without a free bar. And everyone knows the free bar is the best bit of a conference.
That is absolutely true. And unfortunately, David Laws said that count me in for beers in London, chaps. Health one and lockdown has made me thirsty. It's made me thirsty as well. And regrettably, we won't be going for beers after this or a Clubhouse session. We've more or less just done a Clubhouse session, to be perfectly honest, between the three of us. So yeah, it's been absolutely fantastic, Tom. Really appreciate having you along, and glad we could finally do it. And hopefully, we won't wait quite so long next time. When is this? Is there any signs of the meetup coming back?
Oh, it'll come back when these such things are allowed. We'll have it back. Mainly because I love to go to the pub. So
nice one, cool.
I like the off the record chat. That's where you find out all the good industry gossip.
It is.
Yeah,
Dustin, we'll have to definitely get you over from Paris for the kickoff.
You gotta take the Eurostar.
Yeah,
you have to come and speak.
Yeah, definitely. Nice one. Cool. Well, Tom, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Next week we've got two podcasts. Next week we've got Poly AI and we've got Audio Code. So we'll be talking about building enterprise voice assistants with Poly AI and connecting that with any contact center with Audio Code. So do tune in then. Until next time, see you later.